Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the cobbled streets of Renaissance Italy, where candlelight drifts across frescoed walls and the quiet murmur of courtly life fills the air. The scent of parchment and incense lingers as we follow the life of a woman whose story moves like a shadow through history. Lucrezia Borgia. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story of Lucrezia Borgia drifts in like incense from an old Italian chapel, sweet, faintly smoky, and laced with rumor. Born in the spring of 1480 in the small town of Subiaco near Rome, Lucrezia arrived already tangled in the politics of Renaissance power. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was a Spanish-born cardinal, ambitious and charming in that way Renaissance churchmen were often charming, meaning well-dressed and frighteningly determined. Her mother, the Nozza de Cotonè, was a respected Roman widow who ran a string of inns and somehow managed to balance her business ventures with raising several of Rodrigo's children. The Borgias were not the kind of family that stayed quiet in history. They were loud, beautiful, occasionally brilliant, and frequently despised. By the time Lucrezia could walk, her father had already begun maneuvering his way toward the papacy. He loved his children with the indulgence of a Renaissance patriarch, who saw them not only as offspring but as movable chess pieces. Lucrezia, golden-haired and soft-spoken, would become one of his most valuable. She grew up among tutors, servants, and the peculiar scent of wax and parchment. Her education was considered excellent for a noble woman of her time. Latin, music, poetry, manners, and enough philosophy to make her conversation sound gracefully intelligent without threatening any men. Her father's position meant she lived alternately in palaces and guarded estates, often surrounded by courtiers who bowed to her father's ring while muttering insults about his morals once they turned the corner. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the Borgia household moved from semi-wealthy to mythically powerful. Rome shimmered under his rule in ways both dazzling and uneasy. The papal palace filled with musicians, diplomats, priests, and rumor merchants. Even the stone corridors seemed to hum with intrigue. Lucrezia was 12 when the transformation began, old enough to notice how people's smiles toward her changed. Warmer, more calculating. She was no longer just a child of a cardinal. She was now the daughter of the Pope, and that made her, effectively, a piece of living diplomacy. Marriage, for Renaissance nobility, was rarely about affection. It was about geography and money, and sometimes the vague concept of keeping peace. Lucrezia's first engagement was arranged before she could properly understand what the word meant. The groom was a Spanish nobleman, promising enough, but politically inconvenient, before the vows could even be planned. The match collapsed quietly. Her father brushed it off, finding another candidate as though he were changing tailors. At 13, she was engaged again, this time to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, from a powerful Milanese family. The Sforzas were useful allies. They had armies and influence. The wedding was grand, filled with gilded robes and solemn blessings that felt slightly ironic, given how everyone involved knew this was less about holy union and more about political leverage. The bride, barely into her teens, smiled and curtsied through it all. As expected, Rome watched with fascination because the Borgias always put on a good show. Life with Giovanni Sforza began politely enough. He was in his late 20s, respectable, but not particularly remarkable. The two lived in a manner suitable to nobility, banquets, audiences, and an endless series of ceremonial appearances. But Lucrezia's father and her formidable brother, Cesare, were always scheming. Alliances shifted as quickly as the Italian weather, and within a few years, the Forza connection lost its shine. Suddenly, Giovanni was less an ally and more a liability. Rodrigo, being pope, could annul the marriage with a few words, but even popes preferred their annulments to look tidy, so the official reason was that the union had never been consummated. This announcement pleased no one, least of all Giovanni Sforza, who found himself publicly accused of impotence. It was the sort of insult that could destroy a man faster than poison. He fled Rome in outrage, spreading rumors that the real reason for the annulment was far darker, that the Pope and Cesare both had inappropriate affection for Lucrezia. It was a cruel slander, and one that would cling to her for centuries. In truth, there's no credible evidence that Lucrezia was anything but a pawn in her family's maneuvers. But once a rumor finds good gossip conditions, it never dies. Even today, people still repeat the myth as if the Renaissance were a soap opera. After the annulment, Lucrezia's life hovered in uncertainty. For a time, she retreated to a convent, officially for reflection, unofficially because it kept her away from the noise of scandal. The stillness probably suited her. Behind cloister walls, she could breathe without hearing her name whispered down corridors. Of course, even a convent couldn't hold a Borgia for long. Politics called again. In 1498, her father arranged a second marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. Alfonso was young, handsome, and by all accounts genuinely fond of her. For a brief moment, history seems to sigh with relief. The couple appeared happy. They had a son, Rodrigo, named after her father, because subtlety was never the Borgia strong point, but happiness in the Vatican rarely lasted. Cesare Borgia, now commanding armies and collecting enemies like souvenirs, shifted alliances again. The political winds turned against Naples, which meant Alfonso's usefulness expired. He was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's, stabbed by unknown assailants. Against all odds, he survived, carried his chambers to recover under Lucrezia's anxious care. Yet healing was not what her brother intended. Within weeks, Alfonso was strangled by men widely believed to be Cesare's. The official story blamed bandits. Rome, with its usual cynicism, didn't bother pretending to believe it. Lucrezia's grief was real, but in Renaissance politics, mourning had a time limit. She withdrew again from public life, cloaked in black, while her father and brother continued their unrelenting calculations. To survive in that family required stillness, a kind of poised neutrality. Lucrezia learned it well. She smiled when expected, listened more than she spoke, and avoided asking questions that might end with someone dead. By the early 1500s, Europe had grown weary of Borgia intrigues, and the family needed legitimacy more than ever. Rodrigo the Pope sought to cement alliances that would protect his son's military ambitions, and ideally polish the family reputation. Ferrara, a cultivated duchy in northern Italy, offered both its ruling family, the Estes, valued art and culture, but also recognized the advantage of papal favor. Thus, Lucrezia's third marriage was arranged to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The Este court hesitated. The Borgia name by then was shorthand for scandal, but the dowry was massive, and politics rarely says no to gold. In 1502, Lucrezia rode into Ferrara amid cautious applause. The citizens watched from windows. curious to see if the infamous Borgia daughter carried poison in her jewelry or sin in her smile. What they found instead was a woman of composure and charm, who seemed determined to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. Ferrara's court prized elegance over drama. There were poets to flatter, painters to patronize, and endless music. Lucrezia, who had been trained since childhood to glide through rooms filled with scrutiny, fit the environment perfectly. She became a patron of the arts, sponsoring musicians like Josquin des Prez and poets whose verses now only survive in dusty manuscripts. Under her influence, Ferrara became one of the most glittering centers of Renaissance culture, a quieter echo of Florence, but with better manners. Her husband, Alfonso, was practical, serious about engineering and warfare, not given to flowery affection, yet the marriage worked. He appreciated her diplomacy. She respected his steadiness. There are no records of passionate devotion, but also few of conflict. For a Borgia marriage, that was practically bliss. Her father's death in 1503 altered everything. Pope Alexander VI died suddenly after a dinner rumored to have been poisoned, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not. The details blurred quickly, as they usually did in Rome. Caesar's power crumbled soon after. The Borgia Empire that had seemed unstoppable evaporated within months. Lucrezia, watching from Ferrara, understood the value of distance. She mourned privately and avoided political entanglements. By not defending her family too loudly, she preserved her position. Ferrara's rulers admired her discretion. Rome moved on to new scandals. The years that followed were Lucrezia's most peaceful. She focused on family, on governance, and on cultivating a certain image of grace. Her courtly letters, dozens of which still exist, reveal warmth and intelligence. She corresponded with poets and scholars, managed estates, and quietly funded charities. Her household grew. She had several children, some surviving infancy, many not, a common tragedy of the age. Through it all, the rumors never fully died. Visitors to Ferrara continued to whisper about the Borgia poisoner, even as she hosted them with perfect courtesy. It was as if her family's infamy clung to her like a faint scent of incense, pleasant at first, then impossible to wash away. Yet in time, her patience reshaped her reputation. To many in Ferrara, she became not the Pope's scandalous daughter, but their cultured duchess, a woman of dignity who had endured more than most. The Ferrara years coincided with the height of the Italian Renaissance, when art bloomed under the pressure of politics and piety. Lucrezia moved through it all, like someone learning to breathe again. She commissioned chapels, portraits, and even devotional works, a kind of quiet dialogue with her own complicated past. One of her favorite artists, Giovanni Bellini, captured the poised serenity that people found so magnetic about her, an expression balanced delicately between melancholy and calm. Her correspondence from this period sometimes drifts into weariness. The endless pregnancies, the strain of diplomacy, the cautious balance between her Borgia identity and Esther respectability, all left their mark. Yet she endured with the kind of understated strength that never makes headlines, but changes reputations slowly, one graceful gesture at a time. By the 1510s, she was regarded as one of Italy's most admired duchesses, not for power or beauty alone, but for composure. When wars flared across the peninsula, because wars always did, she managed to keep Ferrara stable, persuading her husband toward prudence when others rushed into alliances. Her political instinct, inherited from her father but softened by experience, kept her family safe. And beneath the diplomacy, there remained the faint ache of memory. Her son, Rodrigo, the child of her murdered second husband, grew up away from her in Naples as political custom dictated. She loved him from afar, sending letters and gifts, though the distance must have felt endless. When word came that he had died as a boy, it quietly broke something in her. Observers noted her deep mourning, but few realized how much it lingered. From then on, her devotion to religion deepened, perhaps as comfort, perhaps as habit. By 1519, her health had begun to fade. She was 39, though the Renaissance measured years differently. For a woman who had been married 3 times, ruled courts, and survived the collapse of dynasties, she was already old. That June, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Fever followed, despite prayers, relics, and the best medical advice 16th century Ferrara could offer, which mostly involved bleeding and hope. Lucrezia weakened. She asked for confession, received the sacraments, and on June 24, 1519, drifted into stillness. The city mourned sincerely. Even those who had once doubted her wept. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domi, a quiet place she had often visited, where nuns spoke kindly of her long after. Centuries later, writers would turn her life into a Gothic myth, but Ferrara remembered her differently, as the woman who brought grace to their city and peace to her turbulent name. The soft dust of time tends to settle unevenly for Lucrezia Borgia. The years following her death grew thick with invention. In Ferrara, she was remembered as serene and charitable. In Rome and beyond, her name curdled into legend. The contrast was sharp enough to feel like 2 separate people, one of flesh and patience, another of ink and scandal. As the 16th century drifted into the 17th, stories about the Borgias became something like currency in Europe's imagination. They were whispered in candlelit parlors, embroidered in sermons about sin, and dramatized in plays that claimed historical truth. While delivering none, the family had been so powerful, and their fall so abrupt, that rumor filled the vacuum where clarity should have been. Lucrezia became the most convenient vessel for that confusion. Her beauty, widely noted in her lifetime, made her an easy canvas for projection. Artists preferred her face to her facts. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, left behind enough moral controversy to supply centuries of indignation. His papacy was infamous for nepotism, but then, most were, what set him apart was his unapologetic use of power and his willingness to bend rules that were meant to be unbendable. He arranged lands for Caesare, marriages for Lucrezia, and benefices for every cousin who could sign their name. When he died, even his enemies seemed at a loss. The man they had called a devil had also built one of the most administratively competent papacies of the Renaissance. The contradiction suited his legend, and by extension his daughters. Cesare Borgia, her brother, fared worse in history's memory. Machiavelli admired him as the model of political ruthlessness, describing his efficiency with a kind of horrified awe. Caesare's campaigns across Italy were brilliant, brutal, and short-lived. He dreamed of carving out a Borgia principality, but after their father's death, he lacked papal backing. He ended up captured, exiled, and eventually killed in Spain. His body lay in an unmarked grave for years, a fittingly ambiguous end for a man who once seemed untouchable. Lucrezia's survival, her quiet, strategic endurance, was the thread that connected the family's chaos to something almost admirable. Yet to her contemporaries, it also looked suspicious. A woman who lived through so much intrigue without obvious ruin must have been complicit, they said. It was easier to imagine her as a poisoner or sorceress than as someone simply careful. The myth wrote itself. By the time Renaissance chroniclers and later dramatists began retelling her life, the line between truth and story blurred into a haze. Some insisted she carried a hollow ring filled with deadly liquid, a detail likely borrowed from popular thrillers of the age. Others claimed she kept a private book of poisons, which no scholar has ever found. There were even tales that she presided over decadent feasts where enemies disappeared between courses. The evidence for all this remains conveniently absent. The persistence of such stories says less about Lucrezia than about the discomfort Renaissance society felt toward women who maneuvered power skillfully. Men could plot, murder, and negotiate without losing their reputations. Women doing the same were cast as temptresses or monsters. Lucrezia's composure in public life, her refusal to perform guilt or outrage, made her an ideal target. She was a mirror reflecting both admiration and fear. Ferrara, however, remembered her as the duchess who brought stability to a volatile world. Her husband, Alfonso d'Este, outlived her by almost 2 decades. He spoke of her with respect, sometimes with what sounded like tenderness. Their surviving children continued her legacy quietly. Her son Ercole II inherited the duchy, overseeing Ferrara during a calmer generation. Her daughter Eleonora became an abbess, perhaps the most peaceful fate possible for a Borgia descendant. The city she had adorned retained the traces of her presence. The music she commissioned survived in manuscripts stored behind cathedral doors. The frescoes painted under her patronage faded slowly under candle soot, their delicate saints and angels still echoing her taste, and the convent where she was buried remained modestly intact. Centuries later, travelers to Ferrara described the site in hushed tones. No jewels, no grandeur, only a sense of quiet. The nuns reportedly kept a small lamp burning near her tomb, as if maintaining a vigil not for scandal but for memory. Meanwhile, outside Ferrara, the myth of Lucrezia Borgia hardened. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European writers rediscovered her as a convenient symbol for decadence. They placed her in tragedies and operas, letting her embody both beauty and corruption. Playwrights loved the contradiction. Painters filled galleries with blonde heroines, labeled Lucrezia, whether or not the portrait matched her likeness. The historical woman dissolved into a genre. By the Romantic era, she had been completely reimagined. Victor Hugo's 1833 play, Lucrezia Borgia, portrayed her as both mother and murderer, pure heart trapped in sin's machinery. Donizetti turned that same contradiction into an opera, complete with soaring laments and dramatically timed poison. Audiences adored it. Few cared that the real Lucrezia's life had ended in prayer, not treachery. The fascination endured because it spoke to a larger cultural pattern, the need to turn complexity into cautionary tale. A corrupt pope, a violent son, a beautiful daughter, each played their part in the Renaissance melodrama that Europe loved to retell. What the myths erased was the texture of ordinary endurance, the day-to-day patience of someone trying to remain dignified in a family that never stopped imploding. If we strip away the fables, what remains is a woman navigating an impossible world. She was educated in diplomacy, fluent in several languages, and capable of holding her own in rooms dominated by men who measured worth in conquests. Her power was subtle, exercised through correspondence, mediation, and charm. She knew when to speak and when to disappear. A survival instinct as refined as any art. Scholars who revisited her letters centuries later found little trace of the viperish tone her enemies imagined. Instead, they discovered an even voice, pragmatic, courteous, sometimes melancholic. In one letter to her husband, she managed to discuss grain prices, the health of her children, and a recent poem she'd enjoyed, all within a few graceful paragraphs. The tone suggested not the heart of a schemer, but the rhythm of a life lived in quiet management. Her household accounts, still preserved in Ferrara's archives, list gifts to servants, dowries for orphaned girls, and payments to musicians. The mundane details, candles purchased, fabrics ordered, build a different picture of her than the one carried by rumor. They show a duchess focused on maintaining harmony in a world where harmony rarely lasted. Of course, Ferrara itself was no paradise. The city sat at the edge of the Papal States, a place of constant negotiation. Flooding from the Pole River could undo months of agricultural labor. Neighboring powers eyed its lands. Within the walls, nobles quarreled, and gossip thrived. Yet, under Lucrezia, the court gained a reputation for civility. Diplomats commented that her presence calmed the endless quarrels among courtiers. Some even credited her with tempering her husband's harsher policies. In that sense, she did what few of her contemporaries could. She outlived the spectacle of her name by turning it into routine. While her brother chased empire, and her father traded souls for favors, Lucrezia built something quieter, continuity. Her death did not end the Borgia influence entirely. Branches of the family continued across Spain and Italy, occasionally surfacing in lesser titles, but none ever reached the notoriety or infamy of Rodrigo, Cesare, and Lucrezia. The Renaissance moved on to new obsessions. The Medici rose, artists painted frescoes that made popes blush, and the name Borgia settled into history's long archive of cautionary examples. Yet the fascination never disappeared. Every few generations, writers and historians return to her story, each time with a slightly different emphasis, sometimes villain, sometimes victim, sometimes both. The truth sits quietly between those extremes, like an old coin worn smooth from being handled too often. When modern scholars began comparing contemporary records, they found that nearly all accusations against Lucrezia came from rival families. The Orsini, the Colonna, the Sforza all had reasons to discredit the Borgias. Their pamphlets and letters dripped with moral outrage while conveniently ignoring their own scandals. Renaissance politics was a glass house where everyone threw stones. One of the few near-contemporary sources that described her without venom was a diplomat from Venice who visited Ferrara late in her life. He wrote that the Duchess was gracious and prudent, adding that her manner persuades men to trust her. Coming from a man trained to mistrust everyone, it was almost flattery. He also noted, with mild surprise, that Ferrara under her influence seemed less tense, its court less prone to the sharp-edged rivalries that plagued others. It was faint praise, but genuine. The truth of Lucrezia Borgia lies in such quiet observations. She was neither saint nor serpent. She was a woman balancing grace and strategy in an era that allowed her little room for either. Her survival was not proof of guilt. It was proof of intelligence. Over time, even the church softened its view. Centuries after her death, popes and bishops referred to the Borgia period as a cautionary episode rather than a curse. The Vatican quietly acknowledged that the institution had weathered far worse. As for Lucrezia, her remains rested undisturbed in the convent chapel. Occasionally, scholars requested permission to examine her tomb, but the nuns, guardians of her memory, typically declined. They preferred silence to spectacle. In that silence, her legacy mellowed. Historians began to describe her as a transitional figure, part of the old world of dynastic intrigue, part of the emerging modern ideal of educated, capable women shaping courts through intellect. She bridged 2 centuries without intending to. Ferrara's archives still preserve her handwriting, precise and flowing, the script of someone who valued clarity. Reading her letters today feels oddly intimate, as though she's leaning across the centuries to explain herself in the only way she could, through calm, practical sentences. In one note to a confidant, she apologizes for delayed correspondence, citing headaches and too many letters from Rome. The weariness sounds familiar, even modern, a person caught between responsibilities and expectation. If history had been kinder, she might have been remembered simply as an able duchess, a mother, a patron of music. But legends rarely yield to fairness. The world prefers a little scandal to balance its saints, and so her name became shorthand for everything dangerous about beauty and power combined. The irony, of course, is that the real Lucrezia spent her adult life escaping precisely that image. Her greatest accomplishment may have been not her lineage or her patronage, but her composure, the art of seeming tranquil in a world built on unrest. Even now, when scholars revisit her story, they often pause over the same question: how much of her legend did she know about? Did she realize as the rumors spread that her reputation was leaving her control? Probably. The Borgias understood image better than anyone. She may have simply accepted that her name would always be a reflection of other people's anxieties. Perhaps that acceptance was its own quiet victory. History, after all, moves on, but myths never tire. Lucrezia's ghost still wanders through paintings, novels, and operas, each time reshaped to suit another generation's imagination. Yet beneath all that, there remains the trace of a real woman, one who endured, adapted, and somehow, across 5 centuries of distortion, still invites curiosity rather than condemnation. The longer one lingers over the Borgia years, the more the noise recedes and something quieter begins to emerge. A rhythm of ordinary endurance, a pattern of survival shaped by circumstance rather than grand design. Lucrezia Borgia lived in a century that valued spectacle, yet her truest skill may have been her talent for quiet persistence. The politics of her era demanded masks, and she learned to wear them lightly, with the sort of composure that made people believe they were seeing beneath them. They never really were. In the courts of 15th and 16th century Italy, everyone lived in some degree of performance. Alliances were built through dinners, marriages, and the trading of favors disguised as affection. A misplaced glance could start a feud. An overheard sigh might travel through a dozen retellings and return as slander. Lucrezia understood this theatrical ecosystem instinctively. She didn't fight the rumors around her. She simply learned to move within them, reshaping their edges by acting as if they no longer mattered. That approach worked astonishingly well in Ferrara. The Este Dukes, for all their refinement, were still practical men. They appreciated that Lucrezia brought prestige, papal connection, and a lavish dowry. What surprised them was how efficiently she managed the household once the ceremonial celebrations ended. Letters from courtiers suggest that she kept accounts personally, reading reports late into the night. She wrote evenly about harvests, wages, and the repair of dikes along the river. There is nothing glamorous in these notes, just the unromantic steadiness of administration, which is precisely what holds small states together. The duchy thrived. Trade along the Po River expanded. Artists who had once fled the volatility of Rome or Florence found refuge in Ferrara's calmer climate. Poets filled her salons, grateful for stipends and for the rare novelty of a patron who actually listened. Among them were Ludovico Ariosto, who would later write Orlando Furioso, and a scattering of musicians whose compositions drifted through the palazzo windows at dusk. The city developed a reputation for elegance without arrogance, and much of that tone traced back to her. Of course, harmony never lasts indefinitely. The early 16th century was an age of restlessness. The French pressed southward, the Spanish pushed north, and the Holy Roman Emperor kept an eye on everything in between. The Italian city-states, glittering and fragile, survived by maneuvering between larger powers. Alfonso d'Este excelled at such balance, though his methods tended toward artillery and fortification rather than diplomacy. Lucrezia complemented him with subtler weapons, letters, negotiations, and her ability to remain unruffled in meetings where everyone else spoke too loudly. When war came to Ferrara's doorstep in 1509, it arrived more like weather than invasion. The Papal States, under Pope Julius II, demanded allegiance. Alfonso hesitated, preferring autonomy. Julius, famously irritable, excommunicated him. It was an awkward situation for Lucrezia, whose father had once ruled from the same Vatican, now condemning her husband. Yet she handled it with that same steady patience, writing to intermediaries, sending small gifts to Rome, arranging quiet truces through shared acquaintances. The crisis passed. Ferrara survived mostly intact, and Julius II found new enemies to occupy his temper. Through all this, Lucrezia's personal life wove between devotion and fatigue. She bore 8 children during her marriage to Alfonso, though only a few survived. Contemporary notes mention frequent illnesses, probably the consequence of constant pregnancies and the limited medical understanding of the age. She aged faster than portraits suggest. Visitors described her as pale but composed, her expression gentle, her speech deliberate. The extravagant beauty that painters later immortalized belonged mostly to memory and imagination. What endured was her presence, an aura of stillness that made even volatile men lower their voices. Her correspondence with humanists reveals an introspective streak. She asked after new theological works, requested translations of devotional texts, and occasionally enclosed poems of her own. They were modest pieces, reflective rather than passionate, written in the restrained language expected of a duchess. Still, one can sense in them the slow gravity of someone who had lived too many public reinventions. Her handwriting, precise, leaning slightly forward, suggests determination more than fragility. There were moments when the past intruded. Travelers from Rome sometimes brought news of her brother Cesare's misfortunes, imprisonment in Spain, escape, brief resurgence, and eventual death in battle. She responded with polite sorrow but no visible display. It would have been unwise to dwell too openly on a fallen relative who once terrified half of Italy. Still, one can imagine her remembering the days when his name commanded armies, when their father's voice echoed through the marble halls of the Vatican. Those memories must have carried a bittersweet calm, like the echo of thunder after a storm. As Ferrara's duchess, Lucrezia learned to embody a kind of tempered religiosity. Her piety was sincere, but orderly. Donations to convents, patronage of sacred music, endowments for poor brides. She rarely sermonized. She simply funded quietly. When plague swept through nearby towns, she organized relief from her own revenues, keeping the efforts discreet so as not to embarrass officials who had done nothing. In a time when charity was often performed loudly for reputation's sake, Her restraint startled observers. One chronicler remarked, "The Duchess gives alms as though apologizing for fortune." It was intended as criticism, but reads now like admiration. By 1515, age and loss began to close around her. She was 35, but exhaustion marked her features. The repeated childbirths, courtly duties, and political tensions had worn down her health. Her eldest surviving son, Ercole, was nearly grown. Her younger children trailed behind in the careful choreography of education and betrothal. She moved through the palace at a slower pace, leaning on attendants when necessary, yet still presiding over gatherings with that calm authority everyone had come to expect. Her relationship with Alfonso remained formal but functional. He valued her counsel, consulted her on correspondence, and allowed her increasing autonomy in domestic affairs. In return, she offered loyalty without pretense of affection. It was a partnership built less on love than on endurance. In a world obsessed with appearances, theirs looked remarkably stable, and perhaps that was love enough. Beyond the palace, Italy continued its restless rearrangements. France occupied Milan. Venice plotted new trade routes. The Papacy oscillated between reform and excess. The Renaissance, that dazzling display of human potential, was also a time of fatigue. Art, beauty, and bureaucracy all reaching saturation. Against that backdrop, Lucrezia's quiet governance seemed almost radical. She proved that power could be exercised softly, without spectacle or cruelty, and still hold. Her last years unfolded like a slow dimming. The death of her son, Rodrigo, in 1512, was a wound that never healed. He had been her link to the only marriage that contained affection, and losing him reopened the sorrow she had once hidden beneath Ferrara's ceremony. She retreated further into religious observance, spending long hours in prayer and occasionally visiting convents. The nuns of Corpus Domini, who later received her body, recorded that she was gentle in manner and preferred silence to conversation. There is a certain serenity in these closing images. A woman who began life at the center of Rome's loudest scandals, ending it in deliberate quiet. But serenity is rarely simple. Her health worsened in 1519, following another pregnancy. The child, a daughter, was stillborn. Infection set in quickly, what physicians called fever of childbirth, though the term disguised the reality of infection and exhaustion. For several days she lingered between pain and calm, receiving visitors, giving instructions for her children's future, arranging alms for the poor. Finally, on June 24, she died, aged 39. Her husband ordered that she be buried at Corpus Domini, the convent she had so often visited. The ceremony was subdued. Ferrara's citizens lined the streets, some mourning sincerely, others out of obligation. The cortege moved slowly through the city she had helped shape, passing buildings that still carried traces of her patronage. When the coffin disappeared behind the convent gates, an entire era seemed to recede with it. For a time, her name rested peacefully. Then, as centuries passed and memories warped, the old rumors revived. Playwrights, chroniclers, and later novelists rediscovered the Borgias, polishing their scandals until they glittered again. Lucrezia re-emerged as a character rather than a person. Beautiful, dangerous, impossibly composed. The real woman was reduced to myth because the myth was more entertaining. It is curious how myths linger longer than monuments. The walls of her palaces crumbled, frescoes faded, and yet the legend of Lucrezia remained bright in the imagination of those who needed her to symbolize something: temptation, intrigue, or redemption. Each retelling flattened her further, turning survival into seduction, patience into manipulation. And yet, through all those distortions, the outline of the actual woman can still be traced, practical, composed, resilient. Her story reminds us that history often chooses its villains and heroines less for accuracy than for narrative convenience. The Renaissance adored contradiction, and Lucrezia provided it in abundance, born into sin, living with grace, dying with dignity. Even centuries later, when scholars sift through her letters and accounts, they find not confession but calm. The handwriting remains steady, the tone measured, the sense of order intact, and perhaps that is the truest legacy she left behind. The art of maintaining composure while the world writes its stories around you. For all the extravagance and corruption of her era, she ended her life not as a symbol of decadence, but as proof that grace could survive it. The rest, the poison and whispers and opera arias, belonged to the dreams of others. Even after her death, Lucrezia Borgia's name lingered like a faint perfume in the halls of Italian memory, impossible to wash away yet too delicate to grasp. For centuries, her story drifted in two currents, one flowing quietly through the archives of Ferrara, the other crashing loudly through the stages and pamphlets of Europe. The first told of a careful duchess, the second of a beautiful monster. Both versions survived because people needed both, one to admire, the other to fear. The Europe that remembered her was changing fast. The Reformation cracked the authority of the Church, and anything linked to papal excess became convenient evidence of corruption. Few examples were more vivid than the Borgias. Protestants painted them as proof that Rome had lost its soul long before Luther nailed his theses. The same exaggerations that once fueled gossip now became moral propaganda. Lucrezia, by extension, transformed from a real woman into a metaphor for the sins of an institution. The more exaggerated her legend grew, the better it served the story. In this new moral theatre, she became everything that frightened reformers: sensuality wrapped in silk, intelligence without obedience, a daughter of the papacy who symbolized its downfall. The details of her actual life, her letters, her charities, her children, mattered little. Myths are efficient. They travel light. Soon the image of Lucrezia Borgia bore only a passing resemblance to the Duchess of Ferrara. Painters gave her faces, borrowed from models of their own day, pale and melancholy, framed in gold hair that may or may not have existed. Writers filled the gaps with imagination. By the 17th century, her reputation was sealed. To mention her name was to invoke danger, made elegant. She appeared in sermons as a warning against vanity, in novels as the embodiment of temptation, in gossip as a shorthand for intrigue. The irony was that the real Lucrezia had spent most of her adult life avoiding precisely those qualities. But history has a fondness for irony, especially when it can humiliate the dead without consequence. Her resting place in Ferrara remained modest. The convent of Corpus Domini endured quietly through wars and shifting borders. The nuns, far removed from literary debates, kept their gentle routines, gardening, prayer, and occasional correspondence with scholars who sought permission to see her tomb. Most were politely refused. The sisters believed the Duchess had already endured enough scrutiny. For centuries, the convent maintained its silence, and perhaps that silence protected her better than any defense could. It was only in the 18th century that curiosity returned with polite persistence. Antiquarians, those early hobbyist historians, began cataloguing Italy's noble families. They loved stories that blended romance and scandal, and the Borgias provided both. They visited Ferrara, asked to see letters, and wrote long, dusty essays that mixed facts with speculation. Their tone was less moral outrage and more fascination, like collectors admiring an exotic specimen under glass. Even so, they rarely questioned the rumors. The idea of Lucrezia as a poisoner was simply too entertaining to discard. Then came the Romantics, who found in her myth a perfect stage for their favorite themes: passion, guilt, redemption, and death by candlelight. Poets and playwrights resurrected her as a tragic heroine trapped by fate. Victor Hugo's Lucrezia Borgia, written in 1833, painted her as a mother consumed by remorse, a woman both saintly and damned. It was melodrama, but audiences wept anyway. Donizetti's opera soon followed, turning her name into music, long, mournful arias that made even her crimes sound beautiful. By then, the real history was barely a whisper beneath the applause. Travelers on the Grand Tour visited Ferrara searching for traces of the infamous Duchess. They walked through the quiet streets, perhaps expecting echoes of poison plots or illicit romance. What they found instead were calm piazzas and well-fed cats, a city more interested in its painters than its scandals. Still, guidebooks obliged them with suitably dramatic stories. Tourists love a ghost, and Lucrezia's was conveniently immobile, waiting politely behind convent walls. Meanwhile, historians began the slow work of re-examination. The 19th century, for all its sentimentality, also produced a generation of scholars obsessed with documentation. They dug through Vatican archives, diplomatic dispatches, and court records. What they found disrupted the myth, though not enough to erase it. Though official letters revealed a woman preoccupied with household budgets, negotiations for dowries, and instructions to her secretaries, there were no poison recipes, no confessions of sin, only the dull, steady evidence of administration. These discoveries complicated the legend, but didn't kill it. If anything, they made it more intriguing. Readers now faced two Lucrezias, one of operatic guilt, another of bureaucratic precision. It was easier to believe she contained both, because contradiction feels truer to human nature than simplicity. By the early 20th century, writers described her as a woman half victim, half accomplice, which was about as close to accuracy as popular culture ever gets. What's remarkable is how consistently her story mirrored the anxieties of each era that retold it. In the Renaissance, she represented the danger of feminine influence. During the Reformation, she stood for papal corruption. In the Romantic Age, she embodied forbidden emotion. In the 20th century, she became a prototype of the misunderstood woman, reclaiming her narrative. Each generation found its reflection in her. That may be the truest definition of immortality history can offer. If one walks through Ferrara today, it's easy to imagine her presence still woven into the city's rhythm. The Ducal Palace, once her home, stands with its cool arcades and faint smell of stone dust. The river still moves sluggishly beyond the walls, carrying the same slow light that filtered through her windows. The convent remains, quiet and half forgotten. Scholars who visit describe a peaceful dimness, a hush that feels protective. Somewhere beneath a simple slab of marble lies the woman whose name once terrified Europe. Her grave bears no elaborate inscription, just a reminder that she was a duchess, a wife, a mother, roles the world preferred to forget when it called her a legend. The persistence of her myth raises the question of why certain stories refuse to fade. Part of it is gender, part politics, and part sheer narrative convenience. Lucrezia's life contained every ingredient of a compelling tale: power, beauty, scandal, tragedy. History rarely resists such symmetry. Yet beyond that, there's something quieter at work, a fascination with grace under pressure, with the possibility that dignity can survive even in a corrupt world. For all her family's infamy, Lucrezia never became monstrous in her own right. That restraint unsettled people. They expected fire and found calm instead. In that sense, she outwitted her century, where her father wielded authority and her brother wielded fear. She mastered endurance. Power fades. Terror burns out. But endurance, especially graceful endurance, tends to last. Perhaps that's why, 500 years later, we still whisper her name with a mix of curiosity and respect. If she could somehow observe her long afterlife in history, she might find it faintly amusing. She, who worked so hard to appear ordinary, has been remembered as extraordinary. The daughter of a pope who tried to live quietly has become a myth that refuses to sleep. And maybe in the endless theater of human storytelling, that's the only kind of peace anyone truly achieves. Not silence, but the endless retelling of one's name in tones softer than the original noise. In that endless retelling, Lucrezia Borgia has drifted far from the corridors of power that once defined her. The Renaissance is long gone. The palaces have turned to museums, yet every generation still finds her useful, as though her shadow provides a convenient outline for their own fears and fascinations. Perhaps that is the secret of her endurance. Not villainy, not virtue, but adaptability. She became what each age needed her to be, without ever having to lift a hand from her grave. The nuns of Corpus Domini might approve of that, in their quiet way. They kept her tomb unadorned not out of neglect, but out of a kind of faith that her peace should not depend on spectacle. And so, through centuries of rumor and reinvention, the most enduring image of Lucrezia Borgia is not the poisoner of legend or the Duchess of Ferrara, but simply the stillness of that sealed chapel, where history's noise fades into the slow, patient sound of prayer. As time went on, Lucrezia Borgia's story kept gathering new layers, each one formed from someone else's imagination. By the 19th century, her family's name had become shorthand for elegant corruption, the kind of historical melodrama that allowed readers to feel scandalized while keeping both hands clean. Her image drifted through oil paintings, novels, and operas, her golden hair reshaped to match whatever style was fashionable that decade. Her face refined until she looked more like an allegory than a person. In England, where the Victorians loved moral tales disguised as biographies, writers revived her reputation in expensive volumes bound in red leather. They couldn't resist her contradictions. A pope's daughter, a duchess, a supposed temptress, who had also been a mother of 7 and an organizer of charitable works. To them, she was the perfect combination of vice and virtue, which meant she sold well. History became entertainment, and Lucrezia fit neatly on the shelf between Cleopatra and Mary, Queen of Scots women, blamed for existing too vividly. But even in these retellings, something gentler sometimes appeared between the lines. Scholars with more patience than prejudice began to notice that the surviving letters didn't match the myth. The handwriting, neat and deliberate, suggested discipline rather than deceit. Her vocabulary was measured, her tone kind. She asked after the health of servants, thanked midwives, and apologized for late payments. She wrote of headaches, of fatigue, of the weather details too ordinary to fit the narrative of a villain. A poisoner might have kept secrets, but she kept schedules. These quiet realities forced later historians to reconsider. It became fashionable for a time to rehabilitate Lucrezia Borgia, to declare that she had been unfairly maligned. that she was a victim of slander from jealous men and hostile faction. The pendulum swung so far toward innocence that she risked being turned into another fiction, this time the opposite of the first. Somewhere between the saint and the sinner lay a woman who had simply learned how to survive. Modern historians now lean toward that middle ground. They see in her life a textbook case of how politics consumed families during the Italian Renaissance. Daughters were not people so much as alliances. Marriages could be annulled like treaties. Lucrezia's early years in Rome were shaped entirely by her father's and brother's ambitions, and her later stability in Farra owed as much to her ability to adapt as to any change in fortune. She was, in the plainest sense, pragmatic. That quality has never made for thrilling opera, but it does explain her longevity. The Renaissance courts where she lived were beautiful on the surface and exhausting underneath. Every smile hid calculation. Every letter could be evidence. The city-states of Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, competed for power with a delicacy that barely masked violence. Assassinations were carried out with style, poison was whispered about as an art, and the Vatican functioned like a palace balancing spiritual pretense with political reality. Within that landscape, the Borgias were neither unique nor especially wicked. They were simply successful long enough for others to resent them. Rodrigo Borgia's papacy coincided with the height of this tension. His court was brilliant, multicultural, and decadent. He rewarded talent, but ignored moral optics. Cesare, his most famous son, embodied the new type of Renaissance noble, educated, ruthless, and allergic to modesty. Lucrezia, caught between them, learned diplomacy before she learned adulthood. The habits of self-protection she developed then never left her. By the time she reached Ferrara, she had perfected the art of being agreeable without being transparent, of listening more than speaking, of surviving the ambitions of men without opposing them outright. It's easy to see why. Later generations found her fascinating. In a century dominated by male heroes and tyrants, a woman who managed to navigate power without obvious ruin seemed almost supernatural. But to those who study her closely, there is nothing mystical about her endurance. It was the product of practice, years of learning what could be said safely, what must be implied, and when to smile instead of argue. It's not the stuff of poetry, that it's the logic of survival. The letters from her Ferrara years show flashes of subtle humor. In one, she notes that her husband's enthusiasm for artillery has filled the garden with noise and smoke, adding that she hopes he will soon tire of his cannons and return to music. In another, she discusses the misbehavior of a courtier with such delicate understatement that it takes a second reading to realize she's describing a scandal. Her wit was dry, not loud. What today might be called understated snark. It's easy to imagine her voice calm, even, faintly amused, the tone of someone who has already endured worse gossip than anyone else in the room could invent. The transformation of her reputation over time also mirrors how societies have viewed women in power. In her own century, influence without authority was treated as manipulation. Later, in more romantic eras, it was reframed as tragic charm. Now it reads as competence constrained by circumstance. Each lens reveals more about its viewers than about Lucrezia herself. She has become a permanent mirror for whatever assumptions the present needs confirmed. Even archaeology has joined the conversation. In the 20th century, when researchers finally examined her burial place, they found her remains intact within the modest tomb. There was no jeweled casket, no gilded inscription, just simple stone and a faint trace of textile fibers from her habit. Forensic study suggested no signs of poison or trauma, only natural decline after childbirth. The simplicity of her grave surprised those who expected drama. It matched the quiet grace she had tried to maintain in life. Ferrara itself remains curiously loyal to her memory. Unlike Rome, which remembers the Borgias as scandal, Ferrara speaks of her as heritage. The city's guides describe her patronage of music, her attention to civic welfare, her support for convents and hospitals. The local archives still hold the ledgers she signed, pages browned with age, but legible. In those careful lines of ink, one sees a rhythm of order, payments to tailors, stipends for tutors, donations for widows. Nothing sensational, nothing sinful, just the slow administrative heartbeat of a duchy that valued stability. When one reads those records, the myth of Lucrezia Borgia begins to dissolve like smoke in morning light. The operatic villain fades, replaced by a woman preoccupied with budgets and the health of her children. It's a more modest picture, but also a more human one. She stops being a symbol and becomes a person who woke early, managed her household, wrote her letters, endured gossip, and kept going. That quiet humanity, once rediscovered, changed how scholars talked about her. The modern consensus is that she was neither angel nor demon, but a capable noblewoman navigating extraordinary pressures. She was, in essence, what most people in history have been: complicated and ordinary at once. And perhaps that's the hardest truth for legend to accept, that a life need not be extreme to be remarkable. If Lucrezia could see the centuries of noise that followed her, she might recognize in it a familiar pattern, the world's endless appetite for extremes. Yet somewhere in that echoing chorus, her real voice survives in the even rhythm of her handwriting, in the measured politeness of her letters, in the enduring quiet of her chosen resting place. The Borgia name, for all its notoriety, has long since lost its sting. It now evokes curiosity rather than condemnation, a shorthand for the beautiful chaos of the Renaissance. But Lucrezia's legacy feels different. Her story no longer reads like a cautionary tale or a scandal. It reads like endurance, polished by time into calm. Maybe that's why people still listen to it before sleep. The world has always been noisy, full of bluster and accusation. A story like hers, told slowly, drifts like a lullaby of survival proof, that even in centuries thick with ambition and rumor, someone could live quietly, move gracefully, and outlast them all. And so, 5 centuries after Lucrezia Borgia's quiet death in Ferrara, her story still hums faintly beneath the noise of history, less a melody now, more like the soft vibration of a note that refuses to fade. Her life, stripped of myth, becomes less about scandal and more about endurance. The scandals may have entertained her enemies, but the endurance outlasted them all. In her time, Italy was a tapestry woven with both beauty and brutality. Power was never secure, and faith and politics danced together like quarrelsome siblings. The Renaissance glittered with genius, but it was not gentle. Men like Cesare Borgia built kingdoms with ambition sharp enough to draw blood. Artists like Leonardo painted serenity, while their patrons schemed. And through this contradiction moved Lucrezia, never an artist, never a warrior, but a quiet strategist in an age that didn't quite have a name for such people. Her intelligence was not the kind that conquered cities. It was the kind that prevented them from collapsing. When her father and brother's reputations exploded across Europe in a haze of rumor, she learned that sometimes the best defense was grace. She did not argue, did not protest too loudly, and in doing so, outlasted the men who had shaped her world. When Alexander VI died and Caesarea fell, she was already building her new life in Ferrara, measured, polite, self-contained. The Ferrara court she ruled beside Alfonso d'Este became a rare example of stability. Visitors spoke of its calm, its patronage of music and letters, its moderation. They credited Alfonso, but it was Lucrezia who had turned the palace from a fortress into a salon. She softened power with conversation, with art, with the kind of generosity that feels natural only to people who have learned what fear costs. Yet history remembered the noise instead of the quiet, the poisoned stories, the gossip about forbidden love, the lurid details of banquets. Those were easier to repeat. They appealed to the same appetite that made the Renaissance itself both magnificent and exhausting. It wasn't until centuries later that anyone began to ask why none of the contemporary evidence confirmed the tales. The answer, as it turned out, was simple: because they were convenient lies. Modern research has shown that most of the charges against Lucrezia were politically motivated, circulated by rival families who needed to tarnish the papacy without directly attacking the Pope. It was safer to whisper about the Pope's daughter than to challenge his authority outright. The result was the creation of a myth so persistent it overshadowed the truth for half a millennium. And the irony, of course, is that Lucrezia's own life would have made an excellent story without embellishment. Born into chaos, maneuvered like a pawn, abandoned, widowed, remarried for politics, and yet able to carve out a peaceful, cultured world of her own. That alone was rare enough. But history has a way of rewarding exaggeration. It wants fireworks, not candlelight. If she could see the endless fascination surrounding her name, she might smile slowly, politely, with that same detached amusement she practiced in Ferrara. She would probably understand it better than most. The Borgias, after all, were masters of image. Before the word publicity existed, her father painted holiness onto politics. Her brother painted destiny onto ambition. She, perhaps without meaning to, painted calm onto chaos. In the end, that may be her most lasting achievement, proving that dignity can be as subversive as power. Her stillness, her refusal to fit the mold of either villain or victim, continues to unsettle those who try to categorize her. She remains slippery, undecided, perfectly balanced between sin and grace. And in that balance lies her endurance. It's tempting to imagine her final moments in Ferrara, not as tragedy, but as release. The fever that took her after childbirth must have been brutal, but accounts say she faced it with composure. She arranged her affairs, distributed alms, confessed her sins, and prepared for death with the same quiet authority that had defined her life. When the end came, she was surrounded not by courtiers or soldiers, but by nuns, the one audience in history that would never gossip about her afterward. Centuries later, when scholars dusted off the records of her duchy, they found not chaos but order. Ferrara's economy had grown, its court had flourished, and its reputation for civility had spread. The city she helped shape became a refuge for artists and thinkers long after her death. Even her descendants maintained her balance between culture and restraint. History, it seems, forgot to give her credit, but the evidence of her influence remains in the stones of the city itself. And so, as the centuries unfold, Lucrezia Borgia moved from scandal to serenity. She has become less of a warning and more of a question. What does survival look like when the world insists on misunderstanding you? Her answer seems to echo softly through every retelling. Survival looks like calm. In the stillness of the convent where she rests, her story feels complete. The marble slab above her grave bears no epitaph promising glory or redemption. It simply marks a life that happened to no embellishment, no defense. The legends outside may roar, but inside those walls, there is only quiet, the kind of quiet that outlasts rumor, outlasts outrage, and eventually outlasts the need to explain itself. The truth of Lucrezia Borgia, then, is neither poison nor innocence. It is persistence. It is the slow, steady motion of someone who refused to collapse beneath her own name. Her life began in noise, unfolded in caution, and ended in peace. The centuries that followed have done their best to resurrect the noise, but the peace somehow keeps returning. Perhaps that is why her story remains oddly soothing. It reminds us that reputation is a weather system, unpredictable and temporary, but character quiet, unadorned and steady, can sometimes hold its shape through any storm. Lucrezia Borgia, once the most slandered woman in Europe, left behind not a confession, not a manifesto, but a silence so graceful it still sounds like forgiveness. And if one listens closely enough, through the centuries of accusation and admiration, through the operas and paintings and the gossip turned legend, that silence might still be heard. The calm breath of a woman who lived through history's loudest century and somehow, quietly, remained herself.